came across a story while browsing the web that caught my attention, not because of the actual supposed supernatural beginnings of it, but the effects and after effects it had on some people and the cemetery itself. The Highgate Cemetery. In the early 1800s, London's population had grown rapidly. This led to lack of space for the deceased to be buried. The graveyards were small and became overcrowded, so many unlikely spaces were being used as burial sites. Bodies were being crammed into these small spaces. The smell from these small sites was, as one can imagine, intolerable. And disease would also be rampant. They were neglected and forgotten. Eventually, in the early 1830s, the authorities decided that something had to be done, and Parliament declared that 7 new cemeteries would be opened in the countryside surrounding London. One being Highgate, which opened in 1839 on a former part of the Ashworth estate. The grounds were beautifully landscaped, and it soon became the capital's principal cemetery. It is said to have some of the finest funerary art, with its Tudor Gothic-style church, topped with wooden turrets and a central bell tower and Gothic-styled catacombs. As we know, these styles were very prominent in many classic and some modern supernatural stories, which will lead us eventually to the purpose of this story. Highgate's most famous and said to be one of the most visited graves is that of Karl Marx, but its biggest ever burial was that of Tom Sayers, the most famous bare-knuckled prize-fighter. It was said that over 10,000 mourners were in attendance, including Lion, his faithful dog, who was his chief mourner. It's also the site of George Michael's grave. The decline of the cemetery came as more common burials were favoured over the once expensive, elaborate ones. Families moved away or died off, and from the 1930s to the 1950s, it struggled to be maintained financially. So by the 1960s, the cemetery's funds dwindled, so not only the churches but the grounds gates were closed. In this time, many tales of paranormal happenings had come from the now overgrown and neglected cemetery, and a story developed. In 1970, 2 men, Sean Manchester and David Farrant, claimed on separate occasions to have witnessed an entity. Manchester claimed in an interview that the encounter was with a medieval man of noble origins whose remains had been placed in the area in the early 1800s that was later to become Highgate. He also claimed that the entity practiced black magic and he believed that practicing Satanists had invoked him. Parents claimed states that he spent Christmas Eve night in 1969 at the cemetery and performed some paranormal experiments. He felt as if he was being watched and saw a grey figure with red glowing circles where eyes should be. Parents thought that it could have been a ghost, a spectre, but it wasn't human. Both these claims caught the attention of the media. In the late 60s, early 70s, the British press printed the story telling of a king vampire of the undead. Manchester later claimed that the journalist had elaborated the story so that it would sound more interesting. This brought forward more stories about possible vampires roaming the cemetery. Shock horror. This sparked off the vampire hunts. March 13th, 1970, self-proclaimed vampire hunters went en masse to Highgate, armed with garlic, stakes and crosses. They invaded Highgate. It was claimed these people vandalized, stole and desecrated graves, causing thousands of pounds worth of damage. They entered a tomb in the catacombs, finding 3 empty coffins, doused them with holy water and lined them with garlic. On returning to the tomb a while later, the coffins were still empty and they claimed to have banished the vampires. 4 months later, while out walking, some teenage girls came across a gruesome sight. A burnt, headless corpse was laying on a path in front of them. This was not a victim of murder, but a Victorian body that had been buried at least 100 years before. Curiously, not only had it been burnt, but it had a stake driven through its heart. Another young couple also claimed to have seen an evil-looking entity on the same path as the other teenagers, and it paralyzed them with fear. Reports of dead animals being drained of blood and strewn around the cemetery. This obsession carried on, and more vampire hunters roamed the cemetery, destroying graves, and the tomb that started all the controversy got bricked up. There was police intervention on more than one occasion, and in 1975 a group was formed to restore, protect and care for the cemetery. The Friends of Highgate Cemetery have been paramount in discouraging occult activity and protecting, restoring and conserving the burial grounds. But from 1977 to 1980, mysterious animal deaths were still occurring, and the vampire mystery still lingers.